Welcome, for the very last time, my dear but distant Psychology for Allied Health students, to the very last ALHT106 online lectures. We've gone through 11 of these now. I was able to get week 9 of this off, but we're completing our journey together here. This is going to be the last of the psychology lecture content that you're going to get on this. Even in Diane's face-to-face lecture that follows up on this, she's mostly going to focus a lot on revising the key points of material, getting everyone ready for the exam. So the capstone unit, the last thing that we're doing at the very end here, is health psychology. Now you may be thinking, oh, this is psychology for allied health. Maybe you should have led with this. Maybe this is the most relevant material that we're going to see. But, I mean, that's not exactly true. When we're talking about health psychology, we're talking about the psychology of how people manage particular lifestyle aspects of their health. It doesn't cover everything health-related, obviously, otherwise we wouldn't have had all the other topics. It's also a little bit of a multifaceted topic. It's easier to wrap your head around once you've done all the other material that we've covered over the course of the semester here. So, the structure of what we're going to be looking at today is we'll take a brief look at the historical context of health and how that plays in with psychology here, just because we have to contrast the standard human experience with the experience of modernity to understand the real changes in health that have taken place and how that is reflected in our social behavior and in our psychological self-management. Then we'll talk about how health and human behavior are intrinsically linked in these particular domains that first section will identify. I'll then give you the models of health behavior, probably in a conceptual or theoretic sense, the most important things you'll take away from this lecture. There's 4 models, the 2 main alternatives we're looking at there that I'll go over. We'll talk about the physiology of stress, which helps you understand why these models are so important, why they have the impact that they do. We'll talk about evolutionary mismatch, which explains why stress affects us in the particular way that it does. And of course, we'll end on the high note, talking about coping strategies and how people manage these things. It should be particularly prescient for all of you who are worried about how you're going to do in the final exam, things like that. So let's get started. So, the main thing that I have to talk about here, I've condensed this down from the longer version of this lecture that we gave last year, but the main thing to keep in mind when we want to take a historical perspective on human health and the enterprises of human health is that human beings, on average, when you average out populations, live about twice as long as our genetically near-identical ancestors who lived in traditional societies. I've used this term before, but if any of you don't remember, a traditional society is the way humans existed for most of history, before the dawn of contemporary agriculture. So, before around 12,000 years ago, everybody lived as kinds of hunter-gatherer bands in different parts of the world. It's what our physiological and our psychological intuitions are most well-primed for, but we've kind of put together through cultural artifice a new way of living since then that has changed very rapidly, and we're now very sophisticated. But in that distance, in that chronological distance from the dawn of agriculture coming up to now, we're talking about having lifespans on average twice as long. Now, you'll hear that sometimes, and it's a little bit of an inflated estimate there, because it's only really twice as long when you factor in very high infant mortality rates for most of human history. If you take out the fact that a lot of people didn't make it out of infanthood, we still do have what is sometimes 1 or 2 decades of difference of longer lives that we have nowadays than we used to have in these much more active, challenging, kind of unsettled period of our history, the long period in which we were traditional societies of hunter-gatherers. But how can this be? What has changed between now and then, given that hunter-gatherers live extremely active lifestyles, something that we struggle with today. They eat very diverse diets. Hunter-gatherers, got enormous amounts of exercise just accruing food and securing their territories and things like this, whereas we have a lot of, lifestyle illness these days. For the most part, most of that change in longevity, comes from higher infant mortality, lower infant mortality rates, so higher infant survival, the reduction in violence in society. Society is still pretty violent in its own way these days, but nothing compared to ancestral environments where around 15% of any given population would die in violent conflict, just trying to maintain everyday security. We have better food security, we have better safety, and of course, we now have medical care that dwarfs any of its ancestor ancestor sort of traditions in being able to put us back together when we've encountered some kind of terrible misfortune. And that's a good way to sort of think about it. Although our traditional society brethren are almost always tougher than us, you can even compare that to modern people who live in hunter-gathering communities like in New Guinea and things like this, but when in a hunter-gatherer community you encountered misfortune, it tended to be permanent. We're very good at putting ourselves back together and hedging our risks in the modern world. So just to give a quick comparison there. So these are on the left side over here, some pie charts comparing, even relatively recently in history, between the year 1900 and 1997, what kinds of different things people died of throughout the world. You can see there's a large presence of things like, illnesses and infections and, infection by parasites and viruses and things like this for a lot of, the percentages of people back in the 1900s, whereas nowadays we are mostly dying of much more benign things: heart disease, cancer, strokes. And if you look at this other graph over here comparing state and non-state society averages in terms of, going over long histories of time, how much we don't die of homicide as much anymore, you can see that we've made a lot of progress in these specific domains. But when we talk about, this idea of putting ourselves back together, our better means of coping with physical ailment and disaster in that sense, a lot of it does come down to the center of modern health science, medicine. Modern medicine is our crowning achievement in terms of applied biology. Excuse me, it's my IP. Sorry. It's our crowning achievement in that sense. It's this amazing set of tools that we've put together, so superior to our earlier alternatives. Spiritual and possession accounts, humoralism and hydraulic accounts, where you take out people's blood because you thought they had too much blood, it was making them sick. The vitalism and alchemy accounts, where you would give people shocks to their nervous system in order to get them going. We have a much better way of approaching the mechanisms of the body today, putting ourselves back together and preventing ourselves from getting broken in the first place. Just to put all of this together, the way that we look at it these days, this underlying sense of using the scientific method to understand the underlying biology of how the human body works, and putting that in the context of our psychological and social factors that put different kinds of demands on us. We call that the biopsychosocial model of health these days. It's the way that we approach this. All the models that we're going to be looking at later on today are inside that biopsychosocial model. So we have this tremendously good means of putting ourselves back together and curing ourselves of things that in most of our evolutionary history we had no way of dealing with. It was just a roll of the dice as to whether or not it would kill us. So, just one thing I have to quickly emphasize about this. You may be thinking, but medicine, we've had that for a long time. This isn't just recent modernity like some of those graphs imply. Like the last century or so. We've had medicine for a long time, that's true, but right up until about the 1850s, even in Europe and places where there was a lot of early development of medicine, China as well, generally speaking, because of iatrogenics, the kind of damage you accidentally do to people trying to cure them, and not very good scientific methods for discovering what really works, for a long time in human history, even the ancestors of what we now call medicine would do you more harm than good. A lot of illnesses, you were better off not seeing a doctor because they will, they'll do something wrong and they'll make you worse. It's really quite recently in history that we've put together a good enough understanding of how the human body, mind, and society works that we can put together good, solid medical health interventions. So because we live in a safer and less volatile world, when you look at this profile of how we don't die from infections and violence and things like that as much anymore, that gives you the sense of expansion of what we do still die of. When we're talking about things like cancer, heart disease, things like this, we have not yet discovered immortality, unfortunately. So all human beings do still eventually die. So the kinds of things that we die of now are the things that we just didn't live long enough to die of earlier in human evolutionary history. Nowadays, we primarily die of things like coronary heart disease. We get old enough for our nervous systems to start to fall apart with things like dementia and Alzheimer's disease. We develop, broader cardiovascular disease, hardening of arteries, things like this, various forms of cancer. All of these things are ticking away behind the scenes. On a long enough time scale, you will die of one of them. But nowadays, because we don't die of violence and infections and things like this as much, we live long enough to see these emerge in the population. When you look at all the things that people die of these days, different kinds of organ failure, how big things like diabetes are and metabolic disorders, you can sort of see it as a shifting over time. This is a great stack graph depicting this. Infectious or parasitic diseases, we got that under control. Other chronic diseases, we've sandwiched that down enormously. Because this starts in the 1900s, violence was mostly under control by then. So we got this little percentage of people, who die from accidents and injuries and things like this. But what you're really seeing there is the expansion of cancers and circulatory diseases, although a lot of circulatory diseases, we've beaten them back a little bit, so you can see improvement on that front. But that's why we see the growth of cardiovascular disease and cancer. It's because people are living long enough now for those long-term things to eventually get you, whereas earlier you had a pretty decent chance of things like other chronic illnesses like tuberculosis getting you. So that's the sort of idea. When you're comparing what health looks like today to what health looked like for most of human evolutionary history and traditional societies and things like this, we live long enough for long-term things, just the breaking down of our organs to finally get to us, and we haven't really found good ways to permanently extend the clock on things like this. But when we talk about metabolic disease, that's the real risk factor on this. That's the thing that isn't just, us living long enough to see this new trend emerge. It's something going wrong for us. It's something about how our health is being compromised by modernity. That's the most troubling aspect of this, is that, it's not just that we're dodging infections and injuries and things like this, because we're not only dying more these days of cancer and heart failure, various kinds of metabolic sickness that contribute to this, lifestyle issues that make you more likely to have heart attacks, things like diabetes and things like this are also relatively skyrocketing. And again, it isn't just a pure, we're now able to do this because we don't die of what hunter-gatherers used to die of. If hunter-gatherers, like when European colonization comes to New Guinea and things like this, start to adopt our ways, they take on sedentary lifestyles and eat our kind of food and things like this, they develop the exact same health problems that we do. It's a symptom of how we live our lives. So that's the sort of comparison we're taking away on this, is that for the most part, we are living longer these days, but in some meaningful ways are living less healthy. And it's the emergence of these kinds of lifestyle illnesses that health psychology is mostly concerned with. Illnesses that are only produced by living in modernity and having to negotiate the pressures of modernity versus those of most of our evolutionary history. Anyway, next up we'll be talking about that dynamic, health and human behavior. I'll see you there.